Happy Wednesday, everyone, and welcome back to Cozy Horror with me, Dr. Plague. Let's get you settled in for the middle of the week so we can help you make it to Friday once again. Today's topic of discussion is summertime camping activities, and I think I've got some pretty good stories to help you get into the summer camping mood. Let's start you off today with a story about stories told around a flashlight, on a bunk, in a cabin. Stories that turn out to be a little too real for those involved. Maybe telling them something about the teller that he may be unaware of. Let's start you off with a trip to the Whispering Hole.
The cabin in the woods had been abandoned for years. But one night, a candle burned in the window. We all tried our best to look appropriately terrified, but it was all mostly for show. Jesse liked to tell stories, but none of them were really that scary. The five of us were gathered around a flashlight in our bunkhouse, telling scary stories and generally just creeping each other out. Mike had a sack of junk food he'd snuck in, and Paul had a bottle of pop. We were enjoying just hanging out together more than any of the stories. These were the moments I looked forward to. The gathering of friends as we hung out for the summer. I've been going to Blue Lake Summer Camp for about 4 years now, and what I look forward to the most was spending time with the friends I only got to see at the camp. Jesse, Paul, Steve, and Mike, we had all been going to camp for about the same amount of time, and we'd become fast friends. They all lived in different places and didn't go to school with me, so the only time I got to see them was at summer camp. I didn't have a lot of friends at school, so I lived for their emails and the summers I got to spend with them. "That story sucks," came a voice from the back. We all looked up to see the sixth member of our cabin, Terry Woods, as he lay under his covers reading a comic book. Terry had been coming to camp for about as long as I can remember. He was a weird kid who never really got along with anyone. He'd been through 4 different cabins in 4 years, and I guess it was our turn to get him. He was quiet, didn't really do sports, and just kind of seemed like a creep. He was constantly hiding in the bushes and making people feel uncomfortable, and the counselors had even caught him peeking into bathroom stalls before. They kept talking about kicking him out, but every year he showed up with his bag and a check, so they let him stay. It's probably the only break his parents got from him, and who could really begrudge them a little downtime? Jesse turned to Terry and fixed him with a frustrated look. Jesse hated hearing that his stories were lame, even though most of them were. "All right then, smart guy, why don't you come tell a story? Show us what a real scary story looks like." Terry seemed to think about it for a minute, before putting down his comic book and walking over to sit on the bed with us. We made a space for him that was a little too big, since none of us really wanted to sit next to Terry. He looked into the flashlight beam, and it was like being around a campfire. The light made his skin pale and ghostly, and when Terry looked up, we all sat back a little in surprise. He looked like a corpse, and he seemed to know it. "You guys ever hear the story of the Whispering Hole?" A few of us shook our heads, but Paul nodded. "Some of the older boys told me about it. It's a hole in the woods, and they say you can hear Indian ghosts in it or something." Terry nodded, grinning a little. "Legend says that it's not Indian ghosts in that hole. The story I heard was that long, long ago, a bunch of superstitious farmers buried their kids out there to appease a forest spirit so he would give them good crops." We all leaned in close now, expecting a good story with a lead-up like that. "They say when the land was first settled and all the Creek Indians were safely chased out of the woods, the crops began to fail. An old woman, whom the townsfolk suspected was a witch, told the people that they had angered a forest spirit, and now their crops would do badly. When they asked what they had to do to bring the crops back, she said that they must take one of their children for every year they had settled here and bury them in a deep hole in the woods. Only then would the crops grow again and the spirit would be appeased." We had leaned in closer, our shadows magnified against the roof of the cabin. The townsfolk realized that this meant 8 of their children would need to be sacrificed. So through a lottery, they decided which 8 must be taken. The rich tried to buy their way out, and the poor tried to beg their way out. But in the end, those whose names were drawn were taken to the woods. They were led there by the witch, and some of the men from the village came along too. Suddenly, the ground opened up to accept their sacrifice, and they herded the children into that space. When the last one fell into the earth, the forest erupted in a mighty roar. The crops grew, and the town prospered. But if the townspeople needed to be reminded of the price they paid for their prosperity, they had only to visit the hole in the woods and hear the whispers of the children. The town is gone now, but the hole whispers eternally. We sat in silence for a moment, all of us looking at each other as the story came to an end. Terry had created something special here, but none of us believed it. It was just a story, plain and simple. Or so we thought. "Wow," Jesse said. "Gotta give it to you, Tera. That was a good story." "Oh, it's no story," Terry said. "The hole exists. I've been there." We were silent for a few seconds. Then we all began to laugh, thinking Terry was just making a joke. All of us, except for Terry, that was. As the laughter died, we all looked at his deadpan stare and realized he was serious. "You want to go?" Terry asked. The five of us looked at each other. Did we want to go out in the woods with someone we didn't quite trust and didn't really like? I already figured I knew how the rest would answer, but when Jesse spoke up, it came as a bit of a surprise. "Sure, let's go see this whispering hole. You're in, right?" he said, looking right at me. I surprised myself by nodding, but the other three shook their heads almost at once. Mike was afraid. "It could be dangerous out there. I don't think I want to go." Steve was condescending. "There's no whispering hole. Terry's just trying to play a trick on us, guys." Paul was sensible. "We should get some sleep, guys. Counselor Hank said there was going to be a big hike tomorrow, and we don't want to be tired for it." In the end, though, Jesse wouldn't be turned away, and I certainly wasn't going to let him go by himself. So, Terry, Jesse, and I snuck out of our cabin and trotted off into the woods with only the moon to guide us. "So," Jesse asked, "where is this whispering hole?" "Not far," Terry said, leading the way. "The camp's actually pretty close. It's about a mile, I guess." Jesse balked at that. "A mile? That could take us nearly an hour in the dark." Terry grinned that same jack-o'-lantern grin at him. "Then I guess you better start walking and stop talking." Then he headed off into the woods, and it was either follow him or turn around. At this point, turning around didn't seem like much of an option, so Jesse and I went. The woods were alive in a way that we had never seen during the day. I saw a pair of eyes looming overhead a second before an owl took flight. The crickets hit a reeing point that was close to eye-watering. The sounds of squirrels and birds were replaced by night creatures that were just beginning to come alive. With the moon on high and the wind rustling the overhead canopy, we felt immersed in an alien world the deeper we went into the woods. This was different than the camping we did. This felt almost dangerous, and it was exhilarating to three young boys in the woods alone at night. We followed Terry for about 45 minutes, all of us sweating and waving off the clouds of mosquitoes, before Jesse asked him if he was lost. "No, I know where we're going. It's just a little farther." He had picked up a large limb and was using it as a makeshift machete as he thwacked at the branches. I had found a stick of my own, a large one that I was using as a walking stick, and I saw Jesse looking around for a stick of his own. The way he was doing it, though, made it seem weird. He wasn't looking around in that lackadaisical way that kids look for sticks. Jesse seemed to be looking for a stick with a purpose. "You okay?" I asked, keeping my voice low. Jesse started to answer, but grinned as he found a big stick that looked like a club. He picked it up and took some test swings before turning back to me. "Much better now. I feel way better now that I have something to defend myself with." "You hear something following us?" I asked, looking around to see if I could spot it. "It's more what we're following. I don't really know Terry. Do you?" I shook my head, ducking a low-hanging arm of a pine bough, and yet, here we are, following him into God knows what. "You buy a story about a whispering hole?" I don't know. "Not really," I said with a little shrug. "So then, where's he really taking us? Is this some kind of psycho crap? I want to be ready if it is." I realized that I had done the same thing without thinking about it, and tested the end of my walking stick against the dirt. It was a sorry excuse for a walking cane, but I supposed it was better than nothing. Watching the back of our guide, I suddenly wondered if we could take Tera if it came to it. Terry was fat, but he was also bigger than either Jesse or I. I had seen him play soccer once, and he seemed slow and easily winded. If he got his hands on you, though, I wondered what might happen. He could probably hurt one of us really bad, and then it would be up to the other to either fight him off or run for help. At a mile, I didn't like the thought of having to run all the way back to camp, but I liked the idea of running while Terry stalked me through the woods even less. It didn't matter, though. Not really. Once we came to the hole, it was all irrelevant. The closer we got to our destination, the quieter it seemed to become in the forest. The sounds of night birds and insects softened at first, like sounds heard with the TV volume turned down. But the deeper we went, the more they seemed to become actually silent. We were soon walking through a silent forest, and it made my skin crawl. Forests aren't supposed to be like that, and the idea that something actually lay ahead made me break out in goosebumps. What could it be that had scared all the wildlife away? What could it be, and what would it do to 3 kids who just wandered into its territory? Terry suddenly stopped, declaring that we were there. He stepped past a little ring of trees, and we followed him. Terry had the stick balanced on his shoulder, but when we came into the open space, he pointed at the hole with the gnarled branch. "There it is, boys, the whispering hole, just like I promised." We turned to look, and I could see Jesse's fingers were white as he clutched his club. When we saw the hole, though, those fingers seemed to become boneless, and the stick spilled out of them. He stepped towards the hole like a drowning man paddling for a raft, and I felt equally as moved. The whispering hole wasn't a hole at all. It was like nothing so much as a grave. The grave was about 6 feet tall and 6 feet across. The earth had not been dug out, despite the amount of it sitting on either side of the hole. The way it looked, the earth had simply spat the dirt out like a mouthful of spinach, to have its mouth free of the taste. The pit was deep, too, and Jesse and I bent over to look down into the black mouth of that chasm. The whispering was slight, sounded more like a babbling brook than actual whispering. Jesse made a rude noise, looking back at Terry as he rolled his eyes. "It's just an underground river. You drug us all the way out here to show us an underground river?" Terry shrugged, but his grin never faltered. "It's the whispering hole. Have a listen. They say you can hear the voices of those dead kids down there." Jesse bent over, listening to the sound coming up, but that seemed like a great way to topple into the hole. Instead, I laid down on my stomach, putting my ear over the hole and listening to the sounds inside. I had worried about the edge of the pit crumbling and sending Jesse falling in, but the edge of the pit seemed to be made of stone. It reminded me of nothing so much as one of those random caves you sometimes find in Minecraft. Those openings in the earth that just wait to be found. I had wanted to see if I could squint and see the bottom, but it was too far down to see anything. I wondered how we were hearing the water when a voice whispered up into my ear. "Beware, he's gonna push you in." I looked down into the pit and then over at Jesse, who was straining his ears and looking in. Who had said that? He's pushed so many into the whispering hole. Sometimes it's people he knows. Sometimes it's people from camp. But it's always him. Get out. Get out while you still can. I turned to see if Jesse was hearing this, but that was when Terry made his move. I looked up just in time to see him shove Jesse with both hands, sending him falling into the hole. I rolled before I could really think about it, and it saved me from getting a tennis shoe to the face. Terry was still smiling, but his foot was coming down again and again as he tried to stomp me. I was scared, moving purely off adrenaline, and when I sprang back to my feet, he lifted his stick like he meant to club me. He didn't say anything. He just ran forward with that gnarled branch he had been using to clear the path. I threw my own stick at him and turned, running into the woods as I tried to make it back to camp. I had to let someone know what had happened out here. I ran through the forest like a startled deer, but it seemed like something was stalking me. Something big was behind me, and the farther I ran, the louder and more frantic it became. I felt like Snow White as I ran through the woods, the once enchanting landscape now little more than a nightmare forest that grabbed at me with every step. The pine boughs whipped my face, the rocks and palmettos sliced at my shins, and the constant rustling of something behind me kept me on edge. Every time I would think about stopping or slowing down, I would hear it, and it would pique my adrenaline again. I could have run for hours as I dodged the large something, but eventually I saw the familiar lights of the camp not far ahead of me. The closer I got, the more I expected that frantic rustling to crop up again, It had seemed to chase me all the way from the whispering hole, and I could just see Terry stalking me as he tried to stop me from tattling. What would he do if he caught me? Would he club me with that branch? Or would he just drag me back to the hole and toss me in? When I broke free of the woods and made it back to those familiar cabins, I felt blessed indeed. The scoutmaster came after a few minutes of steady knocking, and he looked grumpy. When I told him what had happened, though, he woke up pretty quick. He pulled me into the cabin and took my statement as he called the police. The police came and had me take them to the whispering hole immediately. Most of them looked like just regular cops, but a few had bags of climbing gear for spelunking. The scoutmaster and I went with the 8 officers and 1 dog, and as the woods got quieter again, I knew we were getting close. When we came into the clearing, I didn't see any sign of Terry anywhere. The guys with the bags looked over the edge of the hole, and with their spotlights, they found Jesse as he lay at the bottom. I was so afraid that he was dead, but one of the officers said that he was moving some when they shone the light on him. They told me later that we had both been very lucky, since Jesse had fallen almost 50 feet into the underground cave. Both his legs were broken, badly broken at that, and he had hit his head pretty hard, but he was alive. The guys with the bags went down to get him, a stretcher coming down on a cord, and when they got there, one of them said that they'd need some body bags after they got the kid airlifted out. There's about 6 other bodies down here, and all of them look like children. Most of this stuff the police either asked me about, or it was stuff that I picked up when I wasn't supposed to be listening. But it paints a pretty grisly picture of Terry's crimes. Well, not Terry, I guess, since there is no Terry. Terry had taken 6 other kids to the hole, 2 of them campers from the previous year, and just shoved them in. He had made up the story of the whispering hole to take other kids out to the spot so he could push them in and listen to them die. A few of the bodies had clearly died on impact, but the coroner said that a few of them had probably lived for a day or 2 as they sat out there dying. The sicko had probably come to check up on them as they lay bleeding to death, and it appeared he had meant to make us his next 2 victims. There's a manhunt going on right now for Terry, but the camp has relatively little information on him. The address they have goes to an empty lot in a trailer park. Terry pays by cashier check every year, and the phone number they have on file goes to a disconnected number. They've never met Terry's mother or father, and they have no idea where he lives. They know that he lives close to the Whispering Hole, but the chances of finding him might be slim if he lives in the woods somewhere with relatives. The camp has agreed to call if he turns up, but camp has definitely canceled this year for Jesse and I. Mom says I can visit him in the hospital if I want, and the paramedics told me that he wouldn't be alive if it wasn't for me. So do yourself a favor, and don't listen to any stories about the Whispering Hole if they're told around the campfire this year. Terry will need a new hunting ground, and he may be coming to a summer camp near you. Good evening, everyone. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thank you so much for joining me for tonight's story. Let's go ahead and thank our patrons. Thanks to Leslie Lou Riddle and Janet for being our Spooky Skeleton tier contributors. Thanks to Emily Coltfoot and Xaronan for being our Ghostly Reader tier contributors. And thanks to Glenn Jenkins for being our Ghostwriter tier contributor. Thanks, everyone. We just couldn't do the show without you. If you'd like to support the show, come on down to Patreon. For just $5 a month, you too can get all of our Patreon rewards, like having your name read out at the end of episodes, and having your spooky a day early on a Tuesday or a Thursday. Patrons also get to suggest a story for me to read on my Monday stories, so come on down and have a look. If you enjoyed tonight's story and you're not already, might I suggest subscribing and hitting that notification? It lets YouTube know that you like what I do here and that you'd love to see more. And I hope we'll see you again next time. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.
Some stories have just enough truth in them to be believable, but some of them could definitely use a little bit more embellishment. Coming up next, we have a story about some kids on what could be their last camping trip. Kids that discover something they had never dreamed of. So let's visit the Orville site.
It was supposed to be my last year in the Scouts, but it would turn out to be my last year for more reasons than just age. I had been in the Boy Scouts since I was 6. My parents thought I needed exercise, and they had been right. I was starting my career as a human couch potato early, and I'd come home from daycare and fall into the cushions as I watched cartoons by the fistful. I had started recording some of my favorites on the TiVo for later consumption by the time I was 5. And that was the summer my dad decided to make a change. My birthday is in June, and just after I turned 6, he took me down to the YMCA and signed me up for Boy Scouts. I wasn't terribly happy about it. I wanted to watch cartoons and kill time until I had to start school. But Dad insisted that it would be a lot of fun. You'll make friends and learn new skills, and you'll be part of something that you'll remember for the rest of your life. So I went along with it and agreed to try it out. I started at the bottom, Scout, and after a few meetings of less than enthusiastic participation, I made a friend. Jacob was in the same boat I was. His dad wanted him to get off the couch and out into the woods, and he was clearly phoning it in as well. He had the idea that we could sit next to each other, and maybe they wouldn't notice if we were just kind of getting by. So we did, and we started talking, and before long we were both having fun. Our knots got better, our crafts got less messy, and after a year and a half, which flew by, we advanced to Tenderfoot. We were both pretty surprised, but the Scoutmaster told us how much improvement we'd made, and we both realized that we not only liked Scouts, but we liked being part of Scouts. We were working on our advancement to second-class Scout when a new kid joined, a kid who would make our duo a triple threat. Nick was already a second-class Scout, but he'd come from a different troop, and the Scoutmaster told him to take a seat at our table. Soon we were talking and laughing and having a blast in that way that kids with a new friend sometimes do. The three of us took second in the Pinewood Derby that year. Nick drove and we crewed, and our rocket went the highest at the science showcase. My couch potato days were well behind me now, and Dad said he couldn't be prouder of me. It was the summer of my 15th birthday, and I was looking forward to going to high school. It was bittersweet, too, because I had told my Scoutmaster that I'd be hanging up my uniform in the fall. By that point, Nick, Jacob, and I were all that was left of the original troop, and we were helping him with the younger Scouts. All three of us were Life Scouts, and I was a little bummed that I'd never make it to Eagle Scout. I didn't have to stop going. They let you stay until you're 18, but I felt that it was time. I was going to start working a part-time job soon, and to be honest, I was afraid of getting made fun of for still being in the Boy Scouts. I know that sounds a little shallow, but most of the people I knew who had done Scouts had gotten out at 12, and I was starting to feel like I was a little too old for the uniform. Jacob said that he would probably hang it up too, but Nick said he was going to make Eagle before he left. That was the other thing I was conflicted about. Jacob and I were going to the same high school, but Nick's family sent him to a private Christian academy, so Scouts were the only time we really got to see him. He said that he would stay in touch, but I think all three of us knew that it would likely be our last summer together. We were all looking forward to the campout in Mineral Hills State Park, and as we rode up there on one of the big yellow buses that Scoutmaster Mark always rented for the trip, we were surrounded by the sounds of laughing, yelling kids who were looking forward to a weekend in the woods. "You bring any snacks?" Jacob asked. The three of us squeezed in the back seat. "You know it," I told him, opening my backpack to show him the collection of chips and sodas that I had brought. "Nick, what about you?" Jacob asked. Nick grinned. "Oh, I got snacks, but I brought the good stuff, too." "You mean?" Jacob asked, but Nick shushed him, saying later when he tried to whisper it. Mineral Hills State Park was a place where we had gone for campouts for years. It was a well-maintained park, something they had cultivated back in the 80s when the land had been used as a mine or something, and there were lots of bathrooms and trails and a swimming hole with a rope to swing off. It was a great place, a place that played quite often in my memories, and after that weekend, in more than a few of my nightmares. The park had legends of its own, of course. There were open mine shafts on the property, and you had to be careful not to fall into them. There were supposed to be some kind of government testing site there in the 50s, but the facility had since closed. It had something to do with animal testing, but no one was really sure about it. There were ghost stories of spectral miners and noises heard in the woods at night, but They were just stories, tales cooked up for campfire stuff. I'd been coming here for years, and I'd never seen anything weirder than a bear or a couple of possums that got into our tent. The park was safe. That's why our parents weren't afraid to let us go there. Safe as a park could be, they would have said. We got there before lunch and started setting up camp. Some of the kids were working on badges for pitching tents and making fires, so they were working on that as we unpacked the bus and set up cook fires in the first aid tent. All three of us had first aid training, and Nick and I were even CPR certified. We had little doubt that we could tend to the scrapes and boo-boos that this bunch would get. And as we got our three-man tent set up, Jacob asked Nick if he could see what he'd brought. Nick opened his bag and held out the last thing that either of us would have expected. A map. "I'm sure it's a great map and all," Jacob said, clearly less than impressed, "but I thought maybe you would have swiped one or two of your older brother's magazines or something." "Priorities, Jake," Nick said as he rolled his eyes. "I got this from my dad's friend who does survey work. I told him I'm doing a report on the park and how it used to be, and he said he had some old maps. I swiped this one. Hopefully he doesn't miss it, but do you see anything interesting?" I looked over it, Jacob giving it a perfunctory look as he munched potato chips, and thought I saw what Nick was talking about. "You're talking about that," I said, pointing to the square on the map about 2 miles from the campground. Nick smiled. "Yes, indeed," he said with a wicked grin. "That, gentleman, is the Orville site, a government testing facility that was built in the 1920s and closed in 1971. The info on what they did there is a little hazy, but it had something to do with animals and their uses during the Cold War." "And you just, what?" Jacob said. "Wrung all of this out of some poor government official in your off time?" Nick rolled his eyes. "No, stupid, I use the internet. You should try it sometime. Like I said, the info is hazy, but I bet the facility is still there. We should go check it out. I bet it's really cool." "Oh, sure," I said, flopping onto my sleeping bag and grabbing a bag of chips for myself, "'cause Scoutmaster Mark is absolutely going to let the three of us blunder off into the woods in the middle of the night." "Already got that covered," Nick said with a grin as he pulled out his badge book. "There's a badge for spotting indigenous night birds, one of the badges I need to be considered for an Eagle Scout. We're going to go out and spot a few birds, just to cover our tracks. Then we're going to make our way here so we can do a little exploring." "Yeah, that sounds fun and all," Jacob said, "but I think I'll pass." "What, you scared?" Nick asked, clearly trying to goad him a little. "No, but the idea of getting arrested for being caught in a government facility and having to explain to my parents how I got there doesn't sound like a lot of fun." Nick made a rude noise. "This place was abandoned years ago, Jake. Come on. It's our last scout camp out. Let's do something really fun. What do you say?" I shrugged. "I'm in, I guess. It does sound like fun. And if the lights are on, we can always leave the way we came." Jacob rolled his eyes. "Fine, I guess I'll go too. Worst I can get is tetanus or exposed to Agent Orange, I guess." We decided that we'd go Saturday night, just so it didn't look like we were too eager. Nick spotted some birds that night, just to cover our tracks, and we helped the kids roast marshmallows and hot dogs and sing along to Scoutmaster Mark's terrible guitar playing. There was no spooky stories the first night. Ghost stories were always for the second and third night for some reason, and as we settled in for bed, we were all excited about what we might find the next day. The next day was full of hiking and badge work for the kiddos. Bobby got his animal spotting badge. Chris got his first aid badge when Terry slipped and cut his knee, and they all got their badge for hiking more than a mile if they didn't already have it. We swam in the lake, we pointed out some edible berries, and all in all, we had a good day. I had almost forgotten about the plan until Nick turned to Scoutmaster Mark and reminded him of it over dinner. Scoutmaster Mark seemed hesitant. We were his responsibility, after all, but Nick assured him that we'd be safe. "We'll be back before midnight. Scout's honor," he said. all of us knowing that Scoutmaster Mark would be out cold after 9, and a herd of buffalo wouldn't wake him up until sunrise. So, after getting the little kids settled and saying goodbye to our Scoutmaster, the three of us set off into the dark woods. It was 9, the sun had been down for about half an hour, and the night bugs and the evening wildlife were in full swing. We walked through a performance of every mating call and wild cry you can imagine, and when we came to the fork that would usually take us to the swimming hole, Nick took us into the woods instead. "Okay," he said, holding up the map and shining his light on it. "About a mile this way, and we should hit the perimeter." "Look," Jacob said, "if this is a joke or something, go ahead and let me know. There's no way any of this is real. This is a scary story that someone made up to freak out kids. If there was a government facility out there, someone would know. We would have seen it. We've hiked all over this." But Nick stopped as he pointed to something up ahead in the trees. "Explain that then, Jake," Nick said, pointing to a rusty barbed wire fence with "Government property, no trespassing" hung from it. Jacob looked at it like he was seeing a mirage. That could just be an old sign." We all hopped the barbed wire fence and proceeded on, Jacob's protest getting stuck on the barbs, I suppose. The woods were unnaturally quiet out here, the leaves scuttering in the wind, the only sound beyond the distant sound of wildlife. There were no birds out here, no insects, and that should have been our first indication that something was wrong. Scouts had taught us that silence in the forest was abnormal, and if you couldn't hear animals, then they had probably gone somewhere else, and you should too. We were all curious about this place that Nick had found, and as we came out of the woods and found ourselves at the edge of a broken concrete road, it only made us want to find this place more. A half hour later, we saw a security hut, but it was dark and unmanned. The glass was starred, cracks running through it, and the interior was full of dust motes. No one except mice and roaches had been there for years, and we followed the road until we came to a concrete building set into the side of the mountain that rose beside the spring. If you hadn't been looking for it, anyone could have missed the place. It was squat and set into the side of the mountain in such a way as to be nearly undetectable. It was dark, of course, and by the number of abandoned jeeps and trucks in the front, it was pretty clear that no one had been here for a long time. There was no sign to tell us its purpose, only a plaque that read Orville site. "The stories say they tested things on animals in there," Nick said. "You think they were making bombs into dogs, or like animals that would attack on command?" "I don't know," I whispered. "And I don't care," Jacob said, a shudder creeping into his voice. "Let's get out of here. This place is spooky." "Aw, come on," Nick said. "It'd be a shame to leave now. We haven't even seen the inside yet." "Nuts to that," Jacob said. "Come on, we found it. We saw it. Now let's go. I got a funny feeling about this place. Something doesn't sit right here." Nick opened his mouth, probably to tell Jacob not to be a baby, when a sound cut through the preternatural silence like nails on glass. Nick looked to the left of the main entrance, now shuttered by a rolling door, and saw a single door with the word maintenance on it. Something was scratching at it, and at the end of each 5-second scratching session, it would make a weird keening noise, like a dog that wants to be let out. We all stared at it, not quite believing what we were hearing. But when Nick started walking towards it, I begged him not to go. "Sounds like someone's dog stuck in there," Nick said, sounding put out with us. "Clearly nothing they were working on is here, so it's probably someone's lost dog." "Well, let them worry about that," Jacob said. "Please, Nicky, don't open the door." Nick made a dismissive sound and went to look at the door. It was padlocked shut, but a couple of hard slaps with a rock took care of that. Nick opened the door, but no dog was on the other side. he made a clicking noise at it, coaxing it out. And that was when something big and gray jumped on him. It may have once been a dog, but what came out now was all bones and graying skin and piercing red eyes. Jacob and I ran. We couldn't help it. We hadn't been afraid of monsters for about 3 to 4 years now, but when a monster presents itself to you, you remember how easy it is to run. Nick was screaming, his voice cutting through the silence around the facility, and every step away from him was like knives ripping at my skin. He was screaming for help. He was screaming for his father, but I'd heard something else, something that lived below the scream like bugs in the underbrush. It was the clittery sound of claws on the pavement. There were more of them. "Climb," I told Jacob, the two of us making for the tree line. We came off the concrete and into the grass, running for the first big gnarled oak we could find. I was the better climber, and I was up the tree in a matter of seconds. Jacob was trying, but he just couldn't get a good grip. He was sliding down as often as he was going up, and I put a hand down to catch hold of him. "Take my hand," I yelled, reaching down to get him. Jacob lunged, and our fingers laced as I started to pull him up. I nearly had him high enough to grab the lowest limb when one of those bone dog things jumped and grabbed his ankle. I tried to hold him, I really did, but his sweaty hand slipped off mine, and when he fell, I heard the pack bury his cries under them. I wanted to help him, but there was nothing I could do. One of those things had gotten Nick. It would tear me to pieces. I held the limb and hid my face, not moving until they finally quieted and stopped savaging Jacob. I glanced down, but he was gone. I looked down, but they were not. There were 6 of them, all of them looking up at me with real interest. Their stubs of tails were wagging like maniac metronomes, and I felt myself shaking as those red eyes stared at me. I thought about climbing higher so maybe they'd forget about me. But if I fell in my fear, then I'd be done for. Instead, I climbed high enough to put my back into a dip in the trunk and got as secure as I could. I don't know how long I sat there, but I must have dozed. I woke up with the midday sun on me and not a skeleton dog to be seen. I looked down hesitantly, not wanting to take any chances, but they were gone. I didn't know if the sun bothered them or if they had gotten bored, but I didn't waste time. I started sprinting for the campsite. I wanted to tell an adult, something I had thought I almost was last night. I wanted to tell them about Nick and Jacob and all those dangerous mutants that would be roaming around now. I needed to tell someone. I needed to tell them before it was too late. Turned out, it was already too late. The park rangers and the police were there when I got to the campsite, and they were very happy to see me. Happy wasn't exactly the word. They were curious to know where I had gone, and glad to have a witness. They told me the entire scout troop had been killed. It looked like a pack of wild dogs had gotten them, and parts of them had been scattered everywhere. As far as they knew, I was the only survivor. When I told them about the Orville site, one of the cops raised an eyebrow. "You saw it?" he asked, looking at me like he couldn't believe it. And when I told him I had, and what had come out, he walked off to make some phone calls. A helicopter came down as the police were taking me home, and I saw guys with guns and camo hopping out to talk with the police. I read a story not long after about how there had been a dangerous explosion in the park, and it would be closed until further notice while they made the area safe again. That was 30 years ago, back in 1994. I haven't been camping or hiking since. I haven't been anywhere near Mineral Hills since then. I have no intention of ever going back. I can't even sleep with the windows open without having a panic attack. So if you happen to be camping in the vicinity of Mineral Hills, listen for the silence. There may be more than coyotes in those woods.
truly spine-tingling, which you might find out there sometimes, if you're willing to look. Next up, we have a tale about a scout troop that was lost, but now appears to be found. At least, until the campfire goes out. Let's hear a story about Troop 45.
I love hiking in the summertime. It's my favorite time of the year. And even though I know it's unadvisable, I like to go solo hiking. The quiet in the woods is intoxicating. Monday through Friday, as I'm sitting in my cubicle typing out useless spreadsheets, I'm thinking of how, come Friday afternoon, I'll be on my way into the woods for another weekend spent in nature. If not for my love of creature comforts, I'd probably have gone off the grid already. I was camping in one of my favorite places, a state park I won't name because they probably don't want the attention. When I walked past the ranger station on Friday, Ranger Donner laughed and called me by name. I'd wondered when I'd see you today. You know there's an opening for a park ranger if you're interested. He had made this offer many times before, and it always made me laugh. Thanks again, Ranger Donner, but they just don't pay you guys enough. Amen, brother, he laughed. Be careful out there. There have been some bear sightings recently. I told him I would, and soon enough I was immersed in the loving embrace of the North Georgia woods. This was Appalachian Trail country, and the woods were full of old things and old ways. Some people were scared of those things, but I'd never been at home more than in these old-growth trees. I had never been more at home than in these old-growth trees. If encountering bears wasn't such a hazard, I would likely have slept out under the stars while I was here. I spent my first night just hiking into the park, looking for a stream I had camped beside several times in the past. Sometimes I fished here, sometimes I just sat and listened to it run, but it was just about the most peaceful place I knew of. The old trees gathered here too, so I guess they liked the river as well, and you could look up at night and see the stars shining through them most any old night. I was always a little jealous of those trees. They got to sit here their whole lives and see those stars, but I was just a tourist. I made it there just as the sun was starting to yawn, and by the time my tent was set up and my fire was dressed, there was no time for fishing. I cooked up some of the food I had brought, hung up my hammock by the light of the dancing fire, and laid out so I could watch the stars. I was careful to put any tasty leftovers away so the bears wouldn't smell them, and put the fire out as my yawns got longer and longer. I slept in the hammock that night and woke up to the sounds of birds and the laughter of the river. It was a great way to start the day, in my humble opinion. I did fish that day, pulling out a couple of little fish and a pretty big trout that must have gotten lost. I cooked up the brim for lunch and figured I would save the trout for dinner, and as the day petered by in its slow way, I was sorry that these times ever had to end. I did some chores, got everything ready for nighttime, and as I cooked the trout and read the Grisham novel I'd brought, I thought I saw something coming together a little further down. It could have been other campers, I suppose, but it sounded like kids. It was never anything consistent, a loud laugh here or the sound of a hammer driving in a stake there, but it kept drawing my attention away from my book and back to the woods. I was nowhere near a campground, the place where people with kids like to camp, and I couldn't see anybody coming in this deep on a Saturday if they knew they were going to have to go home on Monday. Maybe I thought it was someone who was taking a week-long trip, but that was crazy too. Why not camp at one of the regular campsites? They had all the amenities and none of the usual worry about bears lumbering in or accidentally wiping with poison oak. Well, I countered, because they, like you, want to rough it in the wilderness and feel like real pioneers. The more I picked up the sounds of kids, and the more it started to sound like more than one or two, the less likely that seemed. It was edging towards real dark, my trout little more than bones now, when something sprang up all at once and made me whip my head around like I thought the woods were on fire. It was a fire, all right, but
It wasn't a forest fire. About 80 feet to my left, and having sprung up like an elven fire in a Tolkien story, was a campfire. The sounds of children, hazy and ghostly before, had coalesced into something more normal now. They were singing campfire songs, and I lifted my nose a little as the smell hit me. Roasting hot dogs, it smelled like. My own fire was low, a going-out fire, and it was almost too dark to read my book. I'd just about decided to put it out and go to bed when I heard rustling coming my way and perked up. It was making a beeline for my campsite, and it wasn't making any efforts to be quiet. Could be a bear, I thought, or a raccoon who was too full from the scouts' cooler to give my offerings much of a sniff. It came closer, slowly making its way to my campsite, its path wobbling a little as it came, but when it stopped about 10 feet away from me, I felt my breath catch in my throat. Was it watching me? You sometimes heard stories about skinwalkers or wendigos or other weird stuff out here, but I'd never put any stock into it. Now, however, as I sat out here and listened to something getting closer and closer to my camp, I thought they might be onto something. Then I heard a weird raking sound and the unmistakable sound of someone pissing. I looked a little closer, the murky post-sunset light making it hard, and saw a kid in a scout uniform relieving himself on a tree not too far from my camp. He zipped up after he finished, but as he turned to go, he must have seen me, and I saw him start a little. He looked like he might be embarrassed, but he recovered quickly, smiling and lifting a hand to wave. "Geez, sorry, mister. I didn't mean to pee in your campsite. I didn't know anyone else was out here but us." "That's all right," I said. "No harm, no foul." I was getting up to put my book away and climb into my tent for the night. It was going to be a little loud for stargazing, when the kid asked me if I wanted to come and have a hot dog or something. "We've got tons, and I don't think Scoutmaster Dan would mind." I laughed. "No offense, kid, but I doubt your Scoutmaster wants you bringing in random hikers for your wiener roasts." "Oh, he won't mind. We usually invite people to our fire. You can come if you want, but I understand if you don't." I thought about turning him down, but something made me want to go. Maybe it was just the weirdness of finding a scout troop in the woods, but I kind of wanted to go and meet this scoutmaster and find out what they were doing this far out. Curiosity, it seemed, was something I had a little too much of these days. So I agreed, and when I got up on the kid, I could see that he was freckled and ginger-haired, a really bad combo in the scouts for a kid who probably had to use SPF 5000 if he was in the sun. He was dressed in a familiar uniform, though he had a number 45 on his sleeve. I had been a part of Troop 41, but I had never heard of Troop 45 before. Maybe they were new, I thought, and followed the kid back to his campfire. I found 9 other scouts sitting around a roaring blaze with the scoutmaster at the head. He was playing a guitar and singing something I remembered from my own days in the scouts, and when he saw me, his face filled with none of the usual mistrust that an adult would usually have when a stranger wandered into their campsite. He smiled at me, his grin looking predatory in the light, and finished the song before waving us over. "Gabe, who did you find in the woods?" he asked. "He's camping not far from here," the kid, Gabe, said. "I figured he might want a hot dog or something." Sure, the scoutmaster said. "Have a seat. We got dogs for everyone." He turned to a cooler behind him and pulled out a hot dog and a long skewer so I could cook it. I thanked him, introducing myself and saying I hoped this wasn't any trouble. The guy just waved a hand at me, his smile never slipping. No trouble at all. Hope you're not scared off by spooky stories, because as soon as the hot chocolate is done, we're having a story before bedtime." I hadn't noticed the big kettle hanging from the hook over the fire till then. It hissed periodically as some of the hot chocolate fell onto the fire, and
I watched as I sat down next to Gabe and another kid and cooked my hot dog. "Scoutmaster Dan tells the best stories," Gabe said, putting another hot dog onto his stick and roasting it. I relaxed a little, feeling at ease in a way I hadn't since I'd been in the Scouts myself. I was at home in the woods, but there was something soothing about sitting amongst your fellow Scouts and roasting hot dogs over an open fire. It was something I hadn't done since I was 14, and as my hot dog cooked, I glanced at the kid next to me and asked what his name was. The kid didn't say anything, and the longer the silence went on, the more awkward it felt. The kid's silence was preternaturally heavy, and as I glanced away, it felt like he had drawn me into some gravitational pull. "Don't mind Edwin," Gabe said, through a mouthful of hot dog. "He's kinda weird." Scoutmaster Dan started passing out hot chocolate then, taking it down and pouring it into those insulated paper cups. He grinned that odd grin as he handed it to me. He passed one to Edwin, a little harder than he should have, and I expected the kid to yelp as some of it dripped over onto his hand. Instead, he just nodded at the Scoutmaster as he went around to hand out the rest of them. "Well then," Dan said, as he came back to the head of the fire, "let's all give a toast to this year's campout and to the start of spooky stories. Huzzah!" he said, and drank. It must have been scalding, but the kids drank too and finished their cups in one pull. I made to drink mine as well. The hot chocolate smelled great, but I looked down to see that Edwin had put a hand over my cup. He shook his head at me and gave me this weird look as he quickly traded cups with me and drank mine too. Dan's cup must have been fuller than everyone else's because he was the first to start and the last to finish drinking. Boy, that hits the spot, right, kids? Now for tonight's story. Let's tell the old classic about the crazed Scoutmaster. Most of them oohed appreciatively, and as Dan stood over the fire, the shadows turned his face into a ghastly, grinning mask. Once, there was a Scoutmaster who took his troop out for a summer camp out. He brought them to the woods, he fed them, he sang for them, and then it came time for the stories and the customary hot chocolate. One of the kids coughed, but I barely noticed as Dan started the story. He passed the hot chocolate around, and they all drank deeply, and as the warmth washed over them, he began his tale. Another kid coughed, really hacking it up, and I guessed that was understandable if he'd quaffed the whole mug of hot chocolate in one go. Little did the Scouts know that their Scoutmaster had gone a little bit cuckoo. You see, the Scoutmaster's wife had left him. He was living on a friend's couch, and his car was being towed from the school parking lot, even as he sat in the woods. The Scoutmaster's life was over, some would say, but he didn't want it to end alone. So he had put something in the drinks, something that would ensure he had company on the other side. More of the kids were coughing now, and I turned as one of them let out a jet of vomit and fell over. What the hell? Was something going on here? Most of the kids were listening to the story, and even the ones who were coughing or throwing up were looking at the Scoutmaster with rapt attention. I wanted to do something to help them, but yet again, Edwin, the silent kid, put a hand over mine and shook his head. So he told them what he had done. Their Scoutmaster told them the scariest story of all, the story of their own death. He was looking at me now, seeming surprised that I wasn't coughing, but not overly so. They cried and wept. They begged him to say it wasn't true, but it was too late by then. Some of them had already begun to get sick, and as they all died, so too did the crazy Scoutmaster. Now the shadows cast by the fire seemed more like they were revealing him than masking him. Scoutmaster Dan had thick purple bags under his eyes, and his throat was swollen like he'd been hung. His skin was ragged and pale, and as he grinned at me, I saw a roach crawl from his mouth and scuttle over his neck. "That should have been the end of the story," he said, his voice growing raspy. "But every year, the scouts come back for one last jamboree. They cook hot dogs, they sing songs, and they drink their hot chocolate and die all over again. Sometimes they find other people to come with them, and the crazy scoutmaster finds more victims for his troop." I caught something from the corner of my eye, and when I turned to look, I could see others gathering around the edge of the circle. Drifters, hikers, and even a couple of park rangers were standing there, all looking ghostly and all staring darkly into the void. I turned back and jumped. Scoutmaster Dan was right in my face, his terrible grin more skeletal than ever. "It looks like Edwin has stopped me from adding another new friend to our circle. That's okay, though. There's always more, and there will always be more poor, lost souls to add to our troop." His mouth opened much too wide then, and as his skin split and his body fell to dust, I turned to Edwin and mouthed a quick thank you. He opened his mouth to speak, but only bugs came out, and as he too fell into dust, I must have passed out or something. I woke up and prayed that it had all been a dream I'd had in my hammock, but I was still by the remains of the scouts' campfire, and the old and faded cup was sitting on the ground by my feet. I packed up and made my way out of the woods as quickly as possible. I decided I had camped enough this weekend, maybe for several weekends, and as I came back to the ranger station, Ranger Donner hailed me. I must have looked like I'd seen a ghost, har, because he called me again and came running up to ask if everything was okay. Before I could stop myself, I asked him if he knew anything about Boy Scout Troop 45, and he went pale. "Yeah, that's a little bit of local legend, that. Scoutmaster took his troop on a weekend hike and poisoned them. He used some kind of herbs or something, and kids stopped breathing and just kind of went out. That was in," he thought about it, "75 or 76, they tell me. Why? Did you find something out there, or an old tent or something?" I told him I hadn't. I was still just curious about it, but I don't think he believed me. Sometimes people report weird things out in the woods about this time of year. They say they can hear campfire songs or smell hot dogs and hot chocolate cooking. Sometimes they also say they see people. Sometimes people go missing. I'm glad you weren't one of them, kid. I think I might give it some time before I go back to the woods. Some time and maybe a change of campgrounds. I don't want to find myself anywhere close to that particular fire again.
Sometimes trash isn't the only thing you leave behind when you're in the woods. Coming up next, we have a story about a camping trip. Maybe the last camping trip. So let's dive into the last camping trip.
It was just supposed to be a typical camping trip with my scout troop. My friends and I were so excited, Davey, Kevin, and I. We always look forward to these camping trips, and the yearly autumn campout was one of the best. We took a bus to Grayson Falls, a huge state park with so many lakes to swim in, trails to hike, and several caves to explore. All the local scout troops would be there, 10 in all, and we would meet in Starfall campgrounds for the jamboree. There would be canoe races and s'mores and, of course, the annual Scary Story contest. All three of us had been crafting our stories since the last jamboree, and this year we were ready to take that prize. As the bus pulled up to the campsite, we all spilled out of it excitedly. We were the first to arrive, the others getting there tomorrow, but Scoutmaster Larry had wanted us to get there early so we could get the best spots. As I stood in the center of the campground, watching the other scouts mill about, going about their preparations and such, I couldn't help but soak in the sounds and smells of the surrounding forest. Grayson State Park had always been my favorite place to camp, and it was chiefly because it exuded this energy of safety and adventure. It was a maintained park, the park rangers keeping the animals in check and the forest peeled back from the areas where hikers and campers stayed. Even so, it wasn't too hard to imagine a wolf or a bear watching you from the tree line, just waiting to pounce on you unexpectedly. It wasn't too far-fetched to think that something mysterious or unknown could be lurking in those woods as well. We set up our tent a little further back than the others. Scoutmaster Larry had given us a set area where we could pitch our tents, and we had set our own tents at the edge of this. We wanted to feel like real scouts, like trailblazers, and I imagined us like old-timey explorers as Kevin and I set up our tents. Davy had disappeared, and I assumed he was getting water or firewood or something. No sooner had I set up my tent, though, than Davy hissed at us from the woods. "Nice campsite, but follow me if you girls want to do some real camping." He motioned us into the woods. But Scoutmaster Larry said," Kevin stammered. "Who cares what Scoutmaster Larry said? Do you want to camp or what?" We looked at each other. I did feel pulled by adventure, and Kevin, despite being kind of a wet blanket, seemed to feel it too. We nodded, and Davy set out his plan. We would leave our tents here as decoys, since they were already set up, and move off into the woods. Davy knew of a place where we could set up his tent, and we could do some actual camping for the night, away from the adults and the other scouts. It would be like camping on our own, being explorers and roughing it for real. "But what if they come looking for us?" Kevin asked. Davy just waved his hand at the question. "We'll go back to eat, and then after dinner we'll head back to the site. We'll wake up before anyone else gets good and stirring tomorrow, and be back in the camp before anyone notices." I had to admit, it wasn't a bad plan. We would strike our camp after tonight, and rejoin the jamboree tomorrow as the others arrived. No one would miss us for one night, not with so many other scouts around. Kevin and I agreed to go look at the campsite first, wanting to see where he had put it before committing to staying the night there. As we plunged into the forest, Davy led the way. We took no trail, our feet following new ground as they led us to the campsite. As we went, I felt as though I could feel something watching us. It was still early afternoon, and the forest was alive with the sounds of nature, but this tickling on the back of my neck felt a little sinister somehow. I turned to glance around as we went, but I saw nothing more dangerous than a blue jay or a squirrel. I decided I was being silly, and caught up with Kevin and Davy as we headed for our secret campsite. Even Kevin had to admit that the campsite was pretty cool. It was set in a small clearing, and complete with a fire pit that led me to believe that other scouts had used this site before. His tent almost looked out of place here, and I could just imagine scouts before us sleeping under the stars in sleeping bags. Davy asked us what we thought, and I could see that both of us were sold on the idea. We had agreed to come back after dinner, and thus we returned to the group. The rest of the day went fairly uneventfully. We returned to find a hike about to begin, so we tagged along as Scoutmaster Larry showed us nature's glory. We were a little nervous that they might happen upon our campsite, but the hike took us around the nearby creek and up to a natural waterfall that led from the lake nearby. As we returned, Scoutmaster Larry had our dinner cooking on a small fire near the counselor's tent. We set about preparing for the meal, and soon we were all stretched out on the grass eating campfire stew and hardtack bread. As we ate, Scoutmaster Larry laid out the day's events for tomorrow's jamboree. It would be a whole day of canoe races, decathlon contests, and all of it capped off by the scary story reading and the s'more roast. All of us were chattering quietly as we headed off to bed, the sun setting behind us as the three of us pretended to head to our tents. As the sun set low, we moved into the woods and made our way to our campground. As we followed Davy into the woods, I began to hear something strange in the surrounding green. It started as an overriding noise, making Kevin and Davy hard to hear even at close proximity. Davy was too excited to even acknowledge it at first, but I saw Kevin shooting furtive looks into the surrounding woods. The sounds of the forest seemed to be higher than I had ever heard them, and the deeper we went, the louder it seemed to become. The birds sounded like a flock, squawking and chattering animatedly to each other, and many of them sounded like species not even native to the region. As scouts, we were taught to identify local birds. It's for a badge, and many of these sounded different from the finches and quails you usually heard this time of year. I heard deer grunting and the yowls of cats, the growls of a bear, and even the throaty howl of a wolf. The strangest thing of all is, it wasn't the sound or the presence of non-native animals that had me scared. The strangest thing was that each cry was exactly the same. Same sound, same volume, same everything. The others could hear it too, but they were pretending they couldn't for some reason. We could all hear the sounds of animals, all of them much too loud. Kevin was starting to cry. Davy kept insisting that once we made it to the campsite, everything would be okay. He was pulling Kevin along now, Davy's hand wrapped around his wrist. Kevin was nearly frozen with fear, and I could see his eyes shining as he was half drugged through the trail. When we reached the tent, we all went straight in, not daring to even start a fire. We huddled in our tent, Kevin hyperventilating, as Davy and I peeked through the flap. The forest was still very loud, very populated, but it seemed to stop at our campsite. It was like a song heard from behind a door. You know the song, but the words are muffled. We watched the woods, both of us agreeing that we couldn't go back. We would have to stay the night, and Davy thought that we should probably sleep in shifts, too. There's definitely something out there. If we sleep in shifts, we can catch it if it tries to sneak up on us. I agreed, but for the moment, the two of us just watched the woods. The noises were moving away, like a troupe of actors on the move, and Kevin came to join us as well. We spent an hour just watching the woods, and I was surprised when I looked over to find Kevin snoring in the corner. The adrenaline was kicking out, and we were all getting tired. I told Davy I was going to lie down as well, but I just couldn't get comfortable. I was so tired, but my mind wouldn't shut off. I lay there, angrily tossing for what felt like hours, and that was probably why I heard them. I had just started to doze off when the first of the voices scraped across my senses. I woke up to find Davy and Kevin stirring, roused by the voices outside the tent as well. They were familiar voices, campers and scoutmasters we knew, all of them calling our names. They were out in the woods at night searching for us, and their voices clattered through the dark wilderness in a jarring way. They were too loud somehow, disturbing the perfect silence of the night. They also seemed wrong, like the animal sounds from earlier. Each of them was the exact same name, called in the exact same way, again and again. Davy opened the tent, looking out into the darkness for a flashlight. The forest was still dark, the crickets and the night birds alarmingly silent. The quiet of the night was disturbed only by the yelling searchers, and the sounds of their voices were making my skin crawl. Kevin seemed shaken as the voices grew closer and closer. Maybe we should just go to them, guys. They're going to be mad if they find us out here. We should just say we were out here using the bathroom or something. His voice shook as he said it, and I could tell he was getting ready to bolt. Kevin was the type who feared getting in trouble more than silly things like possible death. Davy turned away from the flap to look at him. Are you crazy? If we stay right where we are, they'll never find us. Kevin didn't seem so sure, though. As we stood at the tent flap, watching the woods and listening to the voices, Kevin made a sound like a wounded cat and made a break for the woods. He shoved past us and went running into the brush, yelling that he was sorry for making them look for him. We heard him apologize up until his yells were suddenly cut off. He was stammering apologies one minute, and the next, he was silent as the grave. Davy and I stood looking out into the woods, shuddering in the sudden stillness that held sway across the dark green world. Then, as suddenly as they had stopped, the voices began again. We could hear Kevin's voice amongst them, calling for us to come out. Davy, I said, both of us still looking out into the woods, my eyes having just realized something my brain should have a long time ago. If they're out there looking for us, why don't they have flashlights? Davy contemplated this, and it seemed to scare him just as much as it scared me. We went back inside, huddling in our tent as the voices grew closer and closer. Davy zipped up the doorway and walked backwards into the suddenly flimsy canvas tent. He seemed afraid to turn his back to the doorway and just sort of stood in the middle as he kept his eyes fixed on the secured opening. I hunkered in my sleeping bag, listening to the voices call our names as they came closer and closer. Davy shuddered, cocking his head like a dog who hears a noise. He suddenly took a step back towards the door, and I yelled at him to get away from there. I hunkered down in my sleeping bag, hearing the voices calling our names, and my tears were wet as they slid nakedly down my face. We were trapped out here, alone, with no one to help us. Why hadn't we just stayed with the others? I sunk deeper into my bag, hoping I would wake up to find out this had all been a dream and feel silly for letting it scare me. I opened my eyes as the zipper door slid open. I looked out to find Davy standing in the doorway, looking at the voices that seemed to surround our tent. I begged him to close it, begged him to come back, but he only glanced back at me, almost apologetically. The moon cast his face in stark relief, turning him into a carved totem. and then he turned and stepped out into the night. He left the tent open, and I heard him scream as whatever was calling to us got him. His scream was high and long, cutting through the monotonous calling like an axe through a melon. It cut off at the peak of his terror, and the sound of it ending made me bunch down in the sleeping bag all the more. The next time I heard his voice was when it joined that frightening chorus, all of them now calling for me. I put my hands over my ears, trying to block them out. I wanted them to stop. I wanted this all to be over, and I sat shuddering, suddenly becoming aware that I couldn't hear anything. I pulled my hands away from my ears, slowly at first, and heard nothing but the silence of the outside night. I looked at the flap of the tent and found only the soft rustle of the fabric against the zipper as I began to worm my way out of my warm cocoon. I got about half out when suddenly they were all around me. Their hands pushed at the walls of the tent. Their faces were canvas-covered masks as they tried to push their way inside. I could see their terrible features and hear their ragged breathing as they all shoved at the thin barrier of my tent. There were so many of them, adults, children, animals, and others who resembled nothing so much as skeletons with vaguely human shapes. A shadow fell onto the floor of my dwelling, and I looked to see one framed in the doorway. I zipped my sleeping bag shut then, and hunkered down at the bottom, a snail trapped inside its shell. Outside I could hear the monotonous voices surrounding me again, moving in for the kill as I shuddered at the bottom of my sleeping bag. When I heard the metallic zipper, I knew I was done for. The creature sank its face into the mouth of the sleeping bag, and I cowered as its bony lips peeled back in a mirthless smile. It opened its mouth. It screamed my name, lunging at me with its bony teeth, its pale white skull luminescent in the darkness. I died with the sound of my own name fighting against the rippling scream that rode up my throat. The scouts around the fire looked at me as though I was from another planet. The campfire was the only sound, the logs crackling merrily as the collected troops sat looking at me as I stood in the story circle. Even some of the scoutmasters looked a little rattled by my story, but slowly they started to clap. Scoutmaster Larry clapped the loudest, shaking his hand as he approached. "Now I see why you wanted to go last. That would have been a hard story to top. I think we can agree which story wins this year's Jamboree Short Story Contest." The applause picked up then, and Davy slugged me in the arm as I sat back down. "Can't believe you kept that to yourself all week. I thought Kevin was going to pee his pants." "Was not," Kevin said petulantly, though he looked a little pale, nonetheless. I smiled. Storytelling was something I was good at, and it was always nice to be recognized for my talents. I let my mind slip into the woods around us, hearing the call of a night bird and the whimper of the wind. Perhaps there was something like that out in the woods of the state park. Who could say what lurked in the deep pockets that surrounded areas made for man? I felt myself shiver a little as the wind pushed a sound across my senses, a lonesome sound that sounded eerily like my name. My audience might not be the only one having trouble sleeping tonight. Good evening, my little creeperonis. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thank you so much for joining me for tonight's story. Let's go ahead and thank our sponsors. Thanks to Leslie Lou Riddle for being our Spooky Skeleton tier contributor. Thanks, Leslie. We just couldn't do it without you. If you too would like to have your name read out at the end of every video, come on down to Patreon. For just $5 a month, you can join our Spooky Skeleton tier. As the winter wind begins to whip and we all start thinking longingly of Christmas, don't discount the gift of horror this season. Come on down to Amazon. I've got 4 books, and I'm sure they'd fit anyone's wish list this year. Might I suggest Dark Vortex, which is what we're reading on our Wednesday stories. You can read along with us each week, or on Tuesdays if you're one of my TikTok followers, where I read you guys a live story every week. And of course, thanks for coming by. I hope you'll tune in Tuesday for our throwback story, which we do every week. Until next time, Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.
One more story for you, and I promise I've got a pretty good one to go out on. It's a story about a girl who dreamed of going to summer camp until she discovers that summer camp may not be exactly what she thought it was. So, let's hear about the sleepwalkers of Camp Moonsong.
All I wanted when I was a kid was to go to summer camp. Every summer, I would beg my parents to send me, but they always said the same thing. it's too expensive, or it's too far away, or we can't afford to drive out there when you get homesick. I know, summer camps have fallen out of popularity these days, but they were just about the coolest thing to a kid in the early 90s. Every show had a summer camp episode. There were movies with summer camps. There were even music videos on MTV about summer camps, for God's sake. I felt like I was missing out on a big part of my childhood experience by not being allowed to go, but every year I was forced to sit at home and wish. So when Mom told me that she had found a summer camp for me when I was 11, I was ecstatic. Camp Moonsong was an all-girls camp about an hour from our house, and the fee for 60 days' stay was surprisingly low. Low enough to make Mom suspicious that it was some sort of front for a sweatshop or something, and she read over the paperwork very carefully with my dad. I remember just hovering outside the kitchen as they went over it, Dad not showing her level of dedication as he held paperwork in one hand and smoked with the other. They talk about not being responsible for injuries or accidents a lot in this stuff, I remember Mom saying, and then sighing when Dad scoffed. They're just being careful, Wendy. Sounds perfect, honestly. She's been begging to go to one for years. If we don't send her before 13, I think she'll miss her chance. You know, 12's usually the cutoff on these kinds of things. They discussed it for a while, and when they finally came and said I could go, I was overjoyed. I had my bags packed before the last week of school was even out, and on the second day of summer vacation, my mom and dad drove me to the camp for drop-off. It was beautiful, one of those camps like you see on TV. It was in the middle of the woods with a bunch of little cabins next to a lake, and I could see a boathouse, hiking trails, archery courses, and all kinds of things that I was chomping at the bit to go try. We met the head counselor at the main cabin, a smiling blonde lady named Gladys. And after some hugs and some last-minute checks of my stuff, my parents headed out, and I was shown to the Sparrow cabin, where I would be staying for the next 60 days. That is where I met Lauren, Sandy, Heather, and Claire, the girls who would be my cabin mates. Sandy and Heather were 12, and this was their first time at Moonsong, but not at sleepaway camp. Lauren was 10, and she had never been to camp either, so this was a first for both of us. Claire, however, had been coming here for about 3 years, and she was the only one of us who didn't look excited. She was trying to put on a brave face, clearly not wanting to spook us, but her mood was kind of off. Claire was also our cabin captain, so when the loudspeaker came on, welcoming us and telling us to meet at the pavilion for orientation, she led the way. The pavilion turned out to be a small amphitheater, a stone stage with rows of concrete seats leading up and out of it. We took a seat at the section near the stage, all of us chatting animatedly, except for Claire, as the other cabins assembled. Each cabin had 5 girls. There were 6 cabins in all: sparrow, magpie, grouse, dove, hawk, and crow. They had all spread out a little, giving each cabin room to gather, and as we all sat chattering, the camp counselors arrived to start the orientation. "Welcome, welcome, welcome, campers," said Gladys, her voice echoing off the stone benches, "and welcome to another exciting year at Camp Moonsong." There were a few other adults on the stage, and she introduced them as the activity directors. There was a counselor for swimming, canoeing, archery, hiking, nature studies, physical challenges, and arts and crafts. Gladys told us how our daily schedules would be posted on the bulletin board outside of our cabins at first light, and that each day would end with a marshmallow roast at the fire pit. "And don't forget, the fire pit is where we choose that night's sleepwalker," she said, something that brought nothing but polite claps from some of the campers. I saw more than a few of them that looked like Claire when she said it, and I realized there might be something a little strange at work here. Our first activity was archery, so Claire took us back to the cabin to get ready. "So, what's with the sleepwalker thing?" I asked, Heather chiming in as well as Claire went to go get a shirt that was a little more comfy. It's nothing, she said, stripping out of her polo and slipping on a t-shirt. It's just something that Camp Moonsong does. It doesn't mean anything. It's just tradition. What do you mean? I asked, the four of us falling in behind her as we headed for the range. She made a frustrated noise, rounding on us angrily. Just don't worry about it. If you're lucky, it won't be a problem anyway. There's 30 of us. The chances are good that a few of you might never have to see it, she said, the last more to herself than anything. See what? I asked, but she ignored me as we came to the archery course. We had archery, arts and crafts, and a trip to the lake that day, and by the time the sun set and the bonfire sprang to life, I found I'd quite forgotten about the sleepwalker. We spent a while roasting and eating marshmallows, singing songs, telling spooky stories, and then I saw Gladys step close to the fire with a box that rattled a little. Some of the girls looked at it ominously, Claire among them, but Gladys was all smiles. Okay, campers, it's time to pick tonight's sleepwalker. You returning campers know how it works. If you reach into the box and draw out the black ball, you're tonight's sleepwalker. I snorted, not quite sure why this had some of them so worried. What, were they going to come and scare us in our cabin if one of us drew the black ball? Would we have to scare people? What was this, I wondered, because it all seemed kind of ridiculous. The box had barely gone through 5 people when a girl of about 8 got the black ball. It was clearly her first time here because she seemed pleased but mystified as she handed Gladys back the ball. Gladys asked what her name was and then announced that Brenda was the summer's first sleepwalker. After that, we all went back to our cabins, even Brenda, and I remember sitting up a little with the other girls and whispering about how silly it all was. Were they trying to scare us or something? Ooh, sleepwalkers, we all said as we laughed, but when Claire told us to go to sleep, she said something that took the starch out of our sheets. Wait till tomorrow morning, then we'll see if you still think it's funny. She was right. The bugle woke us up the next morning, and we all shuffled to breakfast in the mess hall. Amidst the chomps of cereal, toast, eggs, and bacon, I heard someone sniffling loudly. It wasn't normal sniffling, like the kind you get from someone being homesick. This was different, and I didn't have words for it yet. I do now that I've grown up a little. It's the hopeless kind of sniffling from someone who's lost something they can't get back, like a mother or a wife crying for a husband or a child. I glanced over at the crow table and saw that it was Brenda. She looked terrible, like she hadn't slept at all, and the circles under her eyes looked more like bruises. She wasn't eating, despite how the girls in her cabin tried to coax her, and her eyes seemed to weep constantly. The crow table was next to ours, and she seemed to be telling them in between sobs that she wanted to go home. They were trying to talk her out of it, saying that the chances were low that she would draw it again, and after a few days she would forget all that she had seen. I didn't exactly know what to make of them, but I would learn. For the next week and a half, I watched as different girls drew the black ball. The ones who had been here before took it better than the new ones, and the new ones were always in tears the next day. Because of how the schedules were set up, we really didn't have a lot of interaction with the other cabins. We lived with the girls in our cabin, but outside of meals and the fire pit, we didn't see the others during the day. Most of them stuck pretty close to their groups during the periods in between activities, and none of them wanted to talk about what was going on if you asked them. Then, about a week and a half after Brenda drew the ball, Heather drew out the jet black sphere and was that night's sleepwalker. I remember the look on her face when she drew it out, the look of uncertainty and fear, and Gladys named her the sleepwalker of the night. She went back to the sparrow cabin, seeming unsure of what to expect, and as we got ready for bed, we all watched her a little apprehensively. "So," Heather asked, "what happens now? Do I start walking or something? Do they come and get me in the night?" "Maybe they're going to make you disappear," Lauren said, and we all laughed nervously. "Just go to sleep," Claire said. and it shut us all up as we looked at her. It won't happen till then. She slid under her blankets and slid a pillow over her head. So we all settled in, turning the lamp off and nestling down for sleep. Heather was soon snoring, as was Lauren, and I yawned as I drifted off as well. I guessed if something was going to happen, then it would happen. Before I knew it, I was dreaming about swimming and friendship bracelets and all the other things I was going to do tomorrow. I woke up in the middle of the night, filled with a need to pee worse than anything I'd ever felt. I was coming back from the latrines, almost back in bed, when I glanced at Heather and saw something that stopped me in my tracks. Heather's mouth was open in a silent oh of a scream. Her hands were bunched up in the covers, and she was writhing slowly on the sheets of her small bed. Her eyes were closed, shut tight like they might be locked that way, and she sucked in breath like she might be screaming in whatever dream she was having. I woke the others, showing them what was happening, and when Sandy reached out to shake her, Claire grabbed her by the wrist. It won't do any good, and it could make it worse. You just have to let her get over it on her own. But we can't just leave her like this. She's in pain, Sandy said. She could be in more pain if you wake her up. She'll come out of this at dawn, so just let her be. We went back to bed, none of us but Claire sleeping, and when the sun came up, Heather came awake, shaking like someone who's been startled badly. She looked around like something might be after her, like this might all be a dream too, and when we came to comfort her, she began to sob. Her eyes had the same dark circles that I'd seen on the other girls, and she walked to chow when the bugle sounded like a zombie. She didn't eat breakfast, and when I asked her what she dreamed about, Claire shot me a nasty look. We don't talk about it. The worst thing you can do is to make her relive it. But if we know what happens when you're the sleepwalker, if you're lucky, Claire said, talking over me as my voice rose, you'll never have to find out. No, Heather said suddenly. No, I want to talk about it. Claire got a pained look. You don't have to. I know what it's like. It's not something you should have to relive. Wait, I said, putting something together that I should have a while ago. You knew this was going to happen, and you didn't warn us. Why didn't you say something? Because it wouldn't have done any good, Claire said. Knowing it's coming doesn't make it any easier. It's terrible, no matter if it's the first time or the fifth. I got chosen twice last year. The knowing doesn't matter. It's terrible. Every time. Do you want to know or not? Heather said, turning to us angrily. Because I'm only going to tell it once, and then I never want to talk about it again. We said we did, and she got a faraway look as she began. I was in the woods. It was night, and everything was dark. Then I felt something watching me, something like a tiger or a bear or something. It was big, whatever it was, because when it roared, it shook all the trees around me. I started running through the woods as fast as I could. You say I was in bed, but my legs ache and my arms feel the pine needles that slashed at them. I ran and ran and ran, but it never seemed to catch me. It was always just out of sight, just out of reach. And the farther I ran, the more afraid I got. After a while, I felt like I was going crazy. I was so scared, so absolutely terrified, and it just never ended. Then, just as the sun came up, I heard it roar, and I heard the trees rustle as it jumped, and I fell down as something heavy hit me. Then I woke up, and you guys were standing there looking at me. She started crying then, and Claire gave her a hug as she assured her that it was over. She was safe now. Needless to say, Heather decided to stay in when we saw it was our turn to hike today. She'd spent a whole night in the woods and saw no reason to spend another hour looking at nature. That's how it went that summer. Every night we drew the balls from the box, and every night it was some girl's turn to spend it in a state of terror. Sandy got her turn, Laura too. Even Claire had to suffer it one night. But never me. Some of the girls went twice, but I seemed to be immune to the black ball. It never chose me. If it hadn't been for the team challenge, I would never have experienced it. Team challenge was Gladys's idea, and she was clearly proud of it. It was the last week of camp, and I'd almost thought I would get away without having to be the sleepwalker. We were gathered for the morning meeting after breakfast, and all of us assembled in the amphitheater. Gladys stood up there, smiling like she had a big surprise for us. And I suppose she was right. Good morning, campers. This week I have something special planned. Today we start the team challenges. 2 cabins will face each other in 3 events: archery, canoe races, and obstacle course. The winner will be immune to sleepwalking for that night. The losing cabin, however, will all have to be the sleepwalkers that night. No one cheered, but we all knew the stakes. The way it shook out was for 3 days the cabins would compete. On the 4th day, one of them would get the bye, and the other 2 would face off. On the 5th day, the last 2 would go head-to-head for the crown of best cabin. Saturday would be color war, and then pickup. Claire took us aside and told us we had to win this. Everyone in the cabin's been the sleepwalker at least once. Well, almost all of us, she said, looking at me jealously. I didn't feel good about it. Quite the contrary, I felt terrible. Heather had been the sleepwalker twice, Sandy too, and I hadn't been picked once. I didn't want to either. I'd watched them go through it, and it looked miserable. As it happens, though, I had one of the best times on the obstacle course, and I was one of the better campers on the archery range. I felt we had a good chance of winning this thing, and the girls agreed as we started making a game plan. The Sparrows beat the Crows on Tuesday, and when we got the bye on Thursday, we were hopeful that we could win this thing, and the incentive was on full display. The losing team showed up to breakfast with bags under their eyes, shaking noticeably as they refused to eat. Whatever was going on, it was even worse in a group, and we were prepared to win against the Hawks and take the whole contest. We had them at archery, but they smoked us at the canoe race. We were certain that we could whip them at the obstacle course, but that's when disaster struck. As Claire came across the final leg of the course, having gone last so I could go first and give us a strong start, she slipped and fell off the beam, the race going to our opponents. The Hawks won, and we would be the sleepwalkers that night. We fought it, trying to stay up as late as we could, trying to stay up all night, but we were just so tired. By 11, we were all dozing. By midnight, we lost the fight. I remember blinking owlishly as I watched Claire drifting off fitfully. When I opened my eyes, I was in the forest. We were all in the forest, looking around as we awoke into some kind of strange shared dream. I was just trying to orient myself when I heard the roar that Heather had described, and it galvanized me in a way that nothing ever had. It was like a bear's roar mixed with something feline and something much deeper. I imagined it was a Tyrannosaurus Rex, the scream of some extinct creature come back to life, and I started running. They were with me in the beginning, all of us neck and neck as we fled into the woods. It was always behind us, stomping through the trees like it was as tall as a redwood. It crashed, it rumbled, and as we ran for our lives, it menaced us from the darkness. Heather was the first to fall. I looked back, meaning to help her, but the darkness swirled up and took her. Her tear-streaked, terrified face was there one moment, and then suddenly she was swallowed up by the gloom. Laura fell next, stumbling as she looked back at Heather, and I didn't look back to see what gobbled her up. I kept running, kept showing my heels, and when Sandy fell too, I didn't even notice right away. I was in a state of panic, something I would later call a heightened terror response when I went to college to study psychology. It was similar to the response prey animals have when they're fleeing for their lives, a kind of thing that gets them eaten by pack hunters when another one pops up on the side while they're focused on the threat behind them. I ran and ran and ran, my legs pumping and my heart racing. I didn't know when Claire fell, or even if she did, but I felt the branches that reached out to slow me down and the rocks that battered my bare feet. I felt every mile that I ran, and I felt every horrifying stumble as I nearly lost my balance. I kept running for my life, and when the sun came up at long last, I didn't stop. I heard it spring, heard it come up from behind me like a tidal wave, but if it hit me, I didn't know about it. I came awake like I meant to fight off an attacker, and the other girls were around me, looking as bad, if not worse. We lost the color war. All of us were too tired to focus. Mom commented on the bruises under my eyes when she came to pick me up, but I just hugged her and said how glad I was to see her. I never spoke about that summer, not until I wrote my senior thesis on the difference between irrational and rational fear in adolescence. I didn't think I would ever visit those memories again, not till today. I've been working as a psychiatrist since I graduated, helping kids get over their trauma and trying to find them some relief. Most of it's normal stuff, divorcing parents or concerned about their school friends. We talk about monsters in closets or stories that won't go away when they close their eyes. Typical little kid stuff, but sometimes I help them tell parents about someone who's doing something they shouldn't, so that person can go somewhere where they can't hurt them again. Those are the good days, the days I feel like I've made a difference. When the girl started telling me about the dreams, the ones she had after her mother said they had enrolled her in camp again, I felt myself beginning to hyperventilate. She described dreams of something big chasing her through the woods at night, about dreams that only come when she was at camp, and only when she was the sleepwalker. I didn't even feel it at first when the pen snapped in my hand, and when the girl said, her voice panicked, that I was bleeding, I looked down to see that my hand had the jagged end of a pen buried in it. I told her mother that she might want to find another summer camp this year, not voicing what I actually believed, so I didn't sound crazy. The mother seemed concerned. "But Jenny loves Camp Moonsong. She's gone every year since she was 9. I strongly recommended that she find her daughter another camp, and the two left mollified with a prescription refill. I had never imagined the place was still open, never in my wildest dreams. I sat in my office, trying to control the shakes as my hand throbbed like an infected tooth. I'm afraid to go to sleep tonight, something I haven't been afraid of since that first week of camp. I'm afraid I might wake up in the woods again, fleeing the thing that chases the sleepwalkers."
And just like that, our stories are at an end for another day. But don't worry, we'll be back tomorrow with more great tales here on Cozy Horror. Till then, this is Dr. Plague wishing you a wonderful day and a spooky evening.